Yeah, no, thanks, James. So welcome all to today's QAAFI seminar. Yeah, I'm the facilitator today, and maybe I guess most of you already know me or met me at one of the QAAFI events. I'm Michael Netzel. I'm a senior research fellow at CNAFS and also one of the chief investigators at the IRC Training Center for Uniquely Australian Foods, and actually by training a nutritionist, very similar to today's presenter, Olivia Wright. Next, I would like to do the acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. Olivia, please next. So yeah, I think the usual one, I'm sure you're all regular attendees of this seminar, which is really very good and a really great seminar. The usual housekeeping things. So I guess we will have Olivia's presentation will take around maybe 40-45 minutes, depending, I'm not sure on or maybe a few minutes, less or more. We'll have at the end a 15-minute Q&A session. And please use, as always, use the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and not the chat button, okay? I got these instructions in bold, not the chat button, but I guess you all know this. And now just then we have at the end, even you have burning questions, so please put them in and we will discuss, and Olivia will address this then at the end of her seminar. Next one. So yeah, it's really great pleasure to introduce Olivia or Dr. Olivia Wright today, our presenter of today's seminar. And Olivia is I think maybe a couple of you guys already met Olivia. Anyway, Olivia is a senior lecturer in Nutrition and Dietetics at the School of Human Movement and Nutrition Sciences, and also a senior research fellow with the Center for Nutrition and Food Sciences, CNAFS at QAAFI. Olivia has a strong track record in leading multidisciplinary research, including clinical trials, adherence to healthy and sustainable dietary patterns, innovative models of service delivery to prevent nutritional decline and improve quality of life for older people, which is really very important, service co-design, delivery, and evaluation across various areas of dietetics practice. Olivia also collaborates with industry partners to trial novel foods and ingredients. So really different area to her teaching commitments. And she currently mentors 8 PhD students and 5 are completing projects with QAAFI. So she's in a couple of PhD students. So we are joined supervising PhD students with Olivia already in a couple of different projects. And so far it's very successful. And I know Olivia are collaborating with her since I think it's almost now 10 years on different projects within or at UQ. Today's title, or the title of today's seminar, Nourishing Nutrient Density, What's Next? So it sounds really interesting, and I guess it's will be a very interesting seminar. And yeah, Olivia, now it's all yours.
Thanks, Michael. I too acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. So thanks for joining today. I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about nourishing nutrient density, what's next. Certainly one aspect of it anyway. So I'm a teaching and research academic. I work across different areas, so School of Human Movement and Nutrition Sciences, as well as CNAFS and QAAFI. And I really enjoy being a part of collaborating across disciplines and these main areas. So just as an overview today, we'll be looking through some food system considerations and utilising a systems approach to examine some of the issues that I'm talking about. So this is an essential process to look at interdisciplinary interactions within the food system and to look at the system as a whole when we're trying to work out how to nourish our nutritional density going forward, because there's just so many different factors interacting and influencing this. I'll give you a snapshot of the background to the current consumption of foods in Australia and numerous data sets that we utilise to examine this, and some intricacies within those, how they differ, how they're similar, and how we can interpret those. Then we'll look at the current way that we're eating and the related health risks, which I'm sure you're all extremely familiar with already. Then the associated planetary risks. So this is an area that we are becoming more and more aware of and need to focus more on in order to enhance our protection of the environment with the way we eat, because we know that our food system is responsible for a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions and can be an area that we can really work on. And we'll look at some recommendations and implications, what some of the latest literature is saying, how some of our research fits into that, and then where to from here. So the systems approach. So this is a conceptual framework of Australia's food and nutrition system. And you'll see that it was first written in Australia's Food and Nutrition in 2012, and also written by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in a document in 1994 by Lester. So we've been studying this diagram for many, many years, and it formed a crucial part of my initial training as well. So you'll see that it looks at the food system as a good flow chart between food supply, distribution, consumption, nutrition, and health outcomes. And you'll see there's a number of interplaying factors there. The space that we primarily work in as dietitian nutritionists, although that is expanding exponentially, I have to say, to work across all areas of the food system. But traditionally, we've focused on this area, which relates to consumer food preferences, targeting their knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, and working on some other related areas there, which of course all influence consumer demand for various areas of the food system and the food supply. So I'll refer to this a little throughout the presentation, just to help put the things I'm talking about into context across the food system. So what do Australians currently eat? Well, we're constantly being barraged with messages regarding what we eat, what we should be eating, what we shouldn't be eating, but what is the actual data saying? So we have a historical perspective here from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And if you're interested in digging into more of this data, you can certainly have a look on their website where the majority of this data comes from. And so we had our last large national nutrition survey back in 1995, and there hasn't been one quite like it since then. However, we did have our National Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey in 2011 and 12, and it measured individual intake using 24-hour recalls, as well as physical activity. And it showed the following results there, as you can see. And I've summarized looking into vegetables and fruit because of our emphasis on foods that can help with planetary health, which is focusing around a more plant-based diet, which I'll get to soon, but also because some of the follow-up studies in later years have focused around vegetables and fruit. So we're comparing like with like. I've chosen to select these particular areas. So you can see the small number of people who met their recommended intake for vegetables. So that's the 5 serves of vegetables each day. And just over half met their recommended fruit intake. However, over a third of our total energy intake is from discretionary foods. So they're foods that are highly processed, high in sugar, salt, and fat, and not particularly good for our health. So then we move along and we have our National Health Survey in 2017 and 18. And they also measured similar types of things. And you can see that things have improved slightly with regard to recommended intake for vegetables, but not really, and not really practically significant. And similar intake for fruit here. And only 6% of children met the recommended intake for fruit and vegetables, which is very, very concerning, given that we know that the majority of the rich micronutrients and phytochemicals, and indeed anti-inflammatory nutrients that have all the benefits for our health, are contained within these fruits and vegetables. However, you can see that children here, according to the data, were more likely to meet their recommendations for fruit intake. So then we had another National Health Survey, which included dietary data, which focused in on a few different areas. And the main difference here was it was conducted during the start, I was going to say during COVID-19, but we're still there, aren't we? Certainly during the commencement and initial phases of the COVID-19 outbreak. And you can see that there's once again, a little bit of increase about recommended intake for vegetables, slight decrease in recommended intake for fruit, but basically over time, it's staying fairly similar. And we have an introduction of SSB, or sugar sweetened beverage intake measurement, here in this survey. And you can see the proportions of people consuming those, which of course is another concerning factor in our dietary habits. Just out of interest, the data showed that men were twice as likely to consume sugar sweetened beverages daily compared to women. Then we look at our apparent consumption data. So this looks at our purchasing patterns and the types of foods we are buying. And these are foods that are purchased from supermarkets. It doesn't include cafes, restaurants, or food that we find ourselves by seeking it out in other areas like fishing and those types of activities. But you can see from this apparent consumption data that 48% of people met their recommended consumption of vegetables, legumes, and beans, which is very contrasting to those other figures. So what's happening there, which I'll get to. And also 70% met their recommended consumption of fruit, but it's also showing a consistent message about our consumption of discretionary foods. So what is this telling us? Clearly, this is not quite what is happening in practice, according to the other surveys. So if you think about your vegetables in your own fridge, what do you do with them? Do you consume all of them? You might buy them, but what happens to them by the end of the week? Are they all eaten? How much of them are not eaten? How much of them are wasted? So that could really start to tell us a little bit more about what these figures mean and what's happening. So there's a lot of excellent research happening across Australia through the Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre initiative, funded by the government and commencing in 2019. And it's looking at the amount of waste we have from households. So 34% of Australia's total food waste is from households. And as part of the 2019 Australian National Food Waste Strategy baseline data, it indicated that 47% of people interviewed threw away fresh vegetables and herbs each week. And this was around 1 cup, which is around 2 serves of vegetables per week. So the data on apparent consumption could be partly explained by, the fact that we're not consuming all of that in our actual households. There's also almost a cup of fresh fruit wasted per week, which is around 1 serve. Interestingly, 81% of people reported no wastage of frozen foods or drinks, which suggests, you use what you need of the frozen, put it back in the freezer, and it doesn't get wasted because it's preserved in there. So very interesting findings, and another really important part of looking at the whole food system to understand intakes and to understand what's happening with regard to nutrition. So these research centres are doing absolutely fantastic work across 3 different areas and looking at ways to really target Australia's food waste. So there's no surprise, there's extensive evidence available that increased rates of chronic disease are directly associated with a less than optimal diet. And if we look at the latest burden of disease data published in the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's latest report from 2021, 50% of the total cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease burden is associated with suboptimal diet, as is 26% of the bowel cancer burden, type 2 diabetes, and stroke. So we can see that we have a significant burden of chronic disease associated with this particular dietary intake that I've just outlined. So poor fruit and vegetable intake and a rich intake of discretionary foods. So what are we going to do? And what other impacts is this having across the food system? Well, it's causing risks to our planetary health as well. And so our lack of consumption of plant-based foods, i.e. fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and our reliance on other, higher protein, meat-based diets is leading to this greater greenhouse gas emissions and not optimum land usage. And so we really need to start shifting our consumption towards plant-based diets. This is not a new concept. You would have heard of this all before, but it's very consistent with our needs for health. But in order to help people to do this, that's the tricky part. So you can see that intake hasn't really changed, particularly over the last several years that I've presented. So how are we going to help people to adopt a higher plant-based diet? And what do we do to help consumers shift their behaviours? So that's where quite a lot of the research that we've been doing comes in. So you would have seen this before too, probably. The Mediterranean Dietary Pattern was created in partnership, or this summary of it was created in partnership between Old Ways and the Harvard School of Public Health and the World Health Organization in 1993. And they devised this food pyramid as a pictorial representation of the Mediterranean dietary pattern. So you can see that there's key principles of the pyramid here. So the things we need to be having most of, you'll note down the bottom, that includes being physically active every day. And that can range from, dancing, walking, playing sports, all sorts of physical activity, even incidental physical activity, and walking further distance, parking further away and walking further. It all adds up and it all is extremely helpful. There's also the key concept of enjoying meals with others and being social and not eating alone, because we know that social isolation and being alone is a key moderator of our health as well. So as far as the food and nutrition goes, these are the things we should be having the most: whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, herbs, spices, nuts, and healthy fats as extra virgin olive oil. And what's lesser known is the actual quantity of olive oil that is recommended, and that's between 2 to 4 tablespoons a day. So there's various ways that you can drizzle this over your vegetables, which you should also be eating, which helps them to taste better. Drizzle over salads, drizzle over all sorts of things that you can be including across your normal dietary pattern. Twice weekly, fish and seafood, moderate amounts of dairy foods, eggs, and occasional poultry, and really important, a low intake of red meats and sweets. And then there's a link there if you wanted to investigate this particular dietary pattern in further detail. So there's substantial evidence as well that's been collated over many years about the health benefits of the Mediterranean dietary pattern. There's excellent evidence that it's associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease and overall mortality. It's associated with healthy aging and cognitive health. And these effects are mediated by its anti-inflammatory mechanisms. So the phytochemicals, the antioxidants, all the different bright colors that you see there represent different phytonutrients or different anti-inflammatory chemicals that are really helpful in preserving our cell health across the body. And something that's really exciting, the Nurses' Health Study found, which was a large study, showed that it resulted in longer telomere length, which is those parts of our DNA that are related to aging. And once they start to shorten, that signals a lot of the aging process and other little mistakes happening in our cells that can lead to other particular diseases and issues. So we know that, it's really beneficial from those aspects. So there, you can imagine the challenges with implementing this dietary pattern in the current environment, where we have a large proportion of discretionary food choices available, ever increasing amount of discretionary food choices available. And people, it's suggested that people may not recognize or understand how to include the components in their diet. We've done some research looking at, what we really need to be able to help people incorporate more of the elements of the Mediterranean dietary pattern into their lifestyles. There's also a lack of cooking across the the board these days for various reasons, time pressure, maybe not quite knowing what to do, but time pressure and stress and rushing around and not taking time to prepare meals at home can be a significant component. And part of the Mediterranean lifestyle is to pass down cooking skills and recipes from one generation to the next. And certain parts of our population would be doing that, but other parts not so much. And as emphasized, eating is such a social event, and these sorts of foods and dietary pattern lends itself to sharing and involving a lot of different people. And when that's not happening, it can also be very challenging to follow. Not to mention the psychological benefits of eating as a shared activity with family and friends. So our research on the Mediterranean dietary pattern commenced several years ago. Back in the around 2014 or so. And we really started this to try and help men with prostate cancer who were being treated with androgen deprivation therapy. So this occurs when the cancer has gone beyond the prostate gland and there is treatment required to help reduce testosterone production. And if it can also be used if the cancer returns after previous treatment or radiation therapy. So unfortunately, this particular treatment results in various metabolic side effects. So for example, dysregulated blood lipids, changes to insulin levels, blood glucose and other related hormones, which can predispose to a number of chronic health conditions or chronic diseases. So we conducted some systematic literature reviews to see what types of dietary patterns or physical activity or exercise treatments were recommended to try and help mitigate some of these effects. And we found there were a few gaps in the literature. So we were particularly zooming in on cancer-related fatigue, treatment-related fatigue, and the dietary changes that we could recommend for this group of people. So these are a couple of the systematic reviews we conducted. Brenton Bagley was our lead PhD student on these particular studies. And it found that, prescribing healthy eating guidelines with combined resistance training and aerobic exercise improved cancer-related fatigue, but there was gaps around the effect of this approach on quality of life. So we really wanted to investigate that more. And it also just prescribed healthy eating guidelines. So there wasn't really any specific Mediterranean dietary pattern or other types of guidelines involved with that. It was basically just following dietary guidelines in general. And then, it's gone backwards a bit there. So then we were looking at nutrition therapy specifically and its effect on cancer-related fatigue and quality of life. And we conducted a systematic review there. And it revealed that preliminary evidence that a plant-based dietary pattern for nutrition therapy would benefit cancer-related fatigue. However, there was less known about its effect on quality of life, and there were no sort of trials around that. So we wanted to investigate that further in this group. So we conducted a pilot randomized controlled trial using a Mediterranean style dietary pattern to see if it would improve cancer-related fatigue and quality of life in men with prostate cancer treated with androgen deprivation therapy. And you can see that Brenton was once again our lead PhD student on this wonderful work, and he's since graduated and doing extremely well in his research and academic life. So we found in the results that the Mediterranean diet in 23 men who were recruited improved cancer-related fatigue at 8 weeks, quality of life at 12 weeks, and also had the side effect of reducing body mass at 8 weeks and 12 weeks. It also reduced lean mass, as you'll see in the results there, and that was the effect of the slight energy deficit that we had as part of the trial. And also it suggested that we potentially could have improved the protein intake within the trial recommendation of diet to really try and prevent that happening as much going forward. But ultimately it showed that it was a safe and feasible dietary intervention. It helped with potential to improve cancer-related fatigue and quality of life in this group of men, and further exploration and larger trials, of course, are recommended. So that was how I started in this field. And then we're really wanting to, we had a PhD student, Yasmin Aridi, who's been investigating people's adherence to Mediterranean dietary principles and how closely Australians are adhering to Mediterranean dietary principles. And so she conducted a secondary analysis of the National Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey, which I presented the data of initially. So that was the one conducted in 2011, 2012 with the detailed dietary recalls. And she accessed data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and she ran a Mediterranean diet questionnaire through the data, which scored how well the data that we obtained from those 24-hour recalls indicated that participants were adhering to a Mediterranean dietary pattern. So we chose to use Tricker-Porlow's 0 to 9 score, 0 meaning no adherence, 9 meaning strong adherence to a Mediterranean dietary pattern. And you can see there was a very large sample size there, over 9,000 people that we were able to do this with. So interestingly, for the data from Australians back in 2011-12, around 20% of people were not adhering very well at all to this dietary pattern. Around 65% were in the middle, so they were utilising a few of the principles, but certainly not a large proportion. And then around 14% of people were in tertile 3, so scoring 7 or 9 for better for adherence. Interestingly, following the Mediterranean dietary style pattern was more likely if people were married, employed, had a high socioeconomic status, were non-smokers, were well educated, had a healthy BMI and waist circumference. And it was also statistically significantly linked to lower blood pressure and lower risk of dyslipidemia. And this project was also conducted in collaboration with a QAAFI collaborator, Professor Eugenie Rohrer. So I'd like to point that out as well. Thank you, Eugenie. So what are the recommendations or implications of all of this? So pleasingly, in July this year, so very recently, a paper in Sustainable Production and Consumption collated interdisciplinary literature about various dietary patterns. So they looked at several. They looked at the Mediterranean diet. They looked at the flexitarian diet, which is a semi-vegetarian diet with heavily reduced meat consumption. They looked at a pescatarian diet, which involves consuming fish and no other meat. A vegetarian diet, so no meat, but dairy and eggs were okay to consume. And also a vegan diet, so no animal consumption at all. And they were wanting to see the impact of these diets on human health as well as animal and planetary health, and to evaluate their sustainability from these perspectives. The really novel and interesting component they also included in this work, which is why I mentioned in the beginning, it's really important to look at the whole system and to also include the consumer box there, is they examined consumer dietary preferences and to see which of these dietary patterns consumers would actually feel able to adopt. So that's a vital component for this research, and that was conducted with 253 people. So the overall effectiveness of the diets for sustainability was analysed using a systematic approach and a systems approach, so looking at the entire food system, the effect on planetary health, animal health, and human health. And the authors termed this a holistic lens. And so they were able to look at multiple factors together, for example, the extent of water use of all of these different dietary patterns. So interestingly, the Mediterranean diet had the third highest overall impact score. So it rated number 3 for environmental health, animal and welfare benefits. The vegan diet and the vegetarian diet rated the best out of all of the dietary patterns for the effect on the environment, as well as animal welfare. And that's no surprise because they're heavily plant-based. And of course, fully plant-based diet was the best for those particular things. However, when you are trying to implement this with consumers, the Mediterranean diet was rated as the most likely to be adopted by the sample of Australian consumers. And this was because it would have taken them less dietary change or adaptation of their own current diets to move towards this pattern. So the key to influencing behavior and to changing behavior is to not change too much at once, like to modify behaviors a little bit at a time. And it seems to be that this is what the consumers were looking for in this instance. So this was published in July, and there was also a conversation article about this paper, which I've included in the link there as well. So the implications of our findings and some of these latest discussions in the literature is that we need to utilize this systems approach. There's so many factors influencing what we eat, what's available for us to eat, as we've seen most recently with various environmental events that have been happening, as well as COVID. But we really must keep consumers involved and keep them in the mix and in the discussions and in the the studies that we do about what should we be doing with regard to planetary health, as well as health for our humans. So where to from here? So in order to improve nutrient density, we need to utilize this systems approach, potentially taking the Mediterranean dietary pattern forward across more areas. We need some innovation improving our consumption of vegetables. So you can see that it's stayed quite static over time, and it's certainly not at a good level. So we need some new strategies across the system. So maybe some innovative processing, maybe some innovative formats. For example, I've indicated there, maybe we should be turning our fresh vegetables into a powder, who knows? Maybe that could be used in various applications to enhance people's consumption of these nutrients. How can we improve the intake? We should be asking consumers, we should be involving them in finding out what we need to do. Is it a formatting issue? Is it a convenience issue? How can we stop people throwing out a lot of their vegetables every week due to poor freshness? It's interesting that the wastage studies are showing that the frozen foods are not as wasted as the fresh. So what message is that giving us? And also tyranny of distance. We know that there's so many communities throughout Australia who have trouble accessing fresh fruit and vegetables. So if they were in a different format that withstood the weather and didn't need refrigeration, for example, that would potentially improve access to these communities. Another potential area which we're working on at the ARC Training Centre for Uniquely Australian Foods is understanding the nutritional benefits and applications of underutilised plant species. Now, how could we harness these to enhance our nutrition? And to these plants are so nutrient dense, like we would need a smaller volume of some of these more native plant species and native bush foods to deliver the same kick of nutrition as we're getting from our regular fruits and vegetables. So how can we harness these and improve these in our food supply? And also a key point of that is also empowering communities as well, empowering our Indigenous communities to improve their own nutrition, but also to gain benefit from the sharing of their Indigenous bush foods with us. So another key point is for our aging population. So as we get older, our nutrient needs change. We may not necessarily need to eat quite as much food, but we still need our micronutrients and our nutrient density. So our appetites might decrease a little if we're feeling a bit sick or can't chew or swallow as well. That doesn't negate our need for nutrition. We need to be able to deliver food for our aging population. Particularly, I'm talking about our aging population in care and in residential aged care, and not even in residential aged care. Hopefully, we can prevent a lot of that happening. But we need to deliver higher nutrient density in smaller volumes. So we need to work out how to do that in efficient and cost-effective ways. So these are some of the areas that we're working on and looking towards going forward. So as far as the food system goes, and certainly the participation of our consumers in the food system, you can see their influence there at a number of levels. We need to empower people to make small changes. That's what the evidence is telling us. And that's certainly what some of this latest research into healthier dietary patterns for health and planetary health are telling us, especially vegetables and legumes. We've got some exciting research coming out from some of Yasmin's work that people have trouble incorporating legumes into their diet. They don't know what to do with them. They're a key component of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, but what do you do with them? So we need to really empower people with guidance around that and how to prepare them and utilize them across the diet. We also need to be mindful of helping people develop practical skills. So in order to prepare these foods and modify diets accordingly to include them, as well as being mindful of financial limitations and taking that all into account. We're really moving towards having a very strong consumer voice across our research. So collaborating with consumers and including their interactions as far as, you know, the development of our research questions, the development of our research methodologies, just as we are in the work we're doing in the Uniquely Australian Food Centre. We're involving our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous community partners in all aspects of the research and investigative process. It's just so important to link in with our consumers and with our communities, because ultimately they're the ones who we're designing things for, so they need to be involved and have a strong voice. So they're amazingly vital contributors to the food system, and we need to include them every step of the way. And that was all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Thanks very much. Really a very exciting and yeah, presentation then, very complex. I mean, the topic, I think if you're all seeing it's not that easy. Yes, no, it's really complex and a lot of things to be considered. And yeah, I think we're starting the perfect in time, the Q&A session. Let's just try to open. Okay, from Heather. Just reading the question, I think that's the easiest way, Olivia. So thank you, Olivia, for great presentations. I was a few minutes late. No worries, Heather. WRT, food wasted by consumers. Is there any research, WRT, food wasted by consumers. Is there any research that you know of that profiles what sorts of products are most commonly wasted? For example, that cup of fruit wasted by Australian consumers, which fruits are most often thrown away? Your thoughts? This would be useful information for growers, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm not sure, to be honest. I would need to look into that and let you know. But certainly fruits and vegetables have a huge wastage profile, and yeah, we need to do something about that. And certainly some of the novel preservation techniques could certainly help reduce that, I think. But yeah, as the actual evidence of which ones are most wasted, I would need to go back into the Fight Food Waste and have a look.
I mean, I read, but I'm not sure, Heather, if it's maybe I'm not sure if who's zoomed in from the Fight Food Waste CRT. Maybe I'm wrong, but it was not a scientific article, but I read something about this waste, and they mentioned that, you know, often bananas, because when they get brown or black, then, you know, children or, you know, they're really often the consumers are not accepted anymore. I think, you know, they're already gone, or you know, you can't eat them anymore. So, and it often goes then straight to the waste, even they are still, you know, absolutely okay. You know, the quality is fine to eat. But what I said, I'm not sure 100% if it's it was not a scientific article, but it was very interesting about this, because the perception is, you know, it's going black, you know, it's old or moldy, maybe gone, you know, overdue. You have to, you know, get rid of the fruit.
And I think, Heather, as well, like there's so much to do with the sensory perception of fruits and vegetables that we need to investigate more, like that's influencing people's consumption. And I think that could be such a wonderful area to explore more in the future with regard to the wastage and the spoilage and what happens, but also just in general.
There is another question, also a very long one, from Michael Rio, hopefully I pronounced this correct. So currently, meat alternative plant-based products are becoming increasingly more accessible and popular in the market. But these products themselves are highly processed with a fairly high sodium and N6 polyunsaturated fatty acid content, correct. Have there been or are there any planned preemptive clinical interventions at the population level to raise awareness that the frequent consumption of these heavily processed meat alternative plant-based foods may not necessarily be healthy dietary practices amongst people who may think otherwise due to the popular perception shaped by marketing that meat-free, plant-based automatically equates to healthy? Yeah, that's a good question.
Yes.
That's one
Yes,
of the
thanks, Michael. Yeah, so this is a very complicated area, and certainly there's been a lot of innovation and development of alternative proteins and things with certainly a positive aim to help planetary health. But at the same time, if they have all those other additions, as you mentioned, added to them, they may not necessarily be as great for our health. So I think we certainly do need some studies to investigate that and to look into consumer perceptions of these foods and work with the groups developing them to improve their nutritional profile. That's the best ways we could manage it. And certainly that's where the whole food systems approach comes in, like not just looking at let's develop something that has less effect on the planet, but not considering the nutritional component or what consumers think or how that would then influence consumers' purchasing and health as well. So it's certainly a very complex area that needs a lot of interdisciplinary work, I think, but working together in a positive way, knowing that, you know, the industries developing these foods are really trying to make a difference planetary wise, but might need some additional assistance to make the foods healthier.
Maybe just one comment, Olivia, and I think, or Michael, I think it's a very, very important question. These things are really now highly discussed, because when you look in a broader range, what Olivia also had in her slides, not only like if it's high, from a nutritional or compositional angle, but also, how you process the food, what you need, how much of energy, and resources. And I think these highly, even plant-based processed foods, there's a big question marks behind many, I know it's maybe a very misused and abused word, but from a sustainability aspect, if it's really that or so much better, what you really need and what resources to produce these high protein, I don't know, burgers or anything, when you compare to others. So I think that's also something definitely even it's plant-based, but it's highly processed plant-based food, you need to be considered definitely. And there's a lot of discussion now, to bring them really how you really value these overall, these products. Yeah,
certainly all the evidence that's out there at the moment for the benefits of, for example, the Mediterranean dietary pattern is based around plant-based foods that are not highly processed. So as far as the effects of these other more novel ones, we need a lot more work on that.
Hang on, there's another question coming in from Anonymous. Okay, Anonymous, we'll read the question. Anonymous, sorry. Is there much known about how food intakes correlate with vitamin mineral levels in the body, particularly in relation to potential differences in nutrient content of similar foods grown in different locations?
The short answer is no, because but it's an area that we, once again, could do with a lot more work in. That's the bioavailability aspect. Certainly, we know that nutritional content of foods grown in different parts of the world with different environmental conditions, different sunlight conditions, genetic variation in the crops, etc., can have huge differences in nutritional content and ultimately, hopefully, absorption into the body and our micronutrient status. So this is something that's really lacking in the literature, and that's why Michael and I do bioavailability studies on a range of different foods, and hopefully we'll be able to continue those into the future. But yeah, it's something that is very important. Like, what are we actually getting of these foods? Do we are they actually have the effect that they say they are? And also, before we do our clinical trials, we always test products to see, or test foods to see what their nutritional content is, and is it what we think it is, and what's the amount of variation within that. And that's a key step in the work that we do. So yeah, that's something, this bioavailability and what are we actually getting from our foods is very close to our hearts, and we need to do more work in that.
Yeah, no, that's really, really important, from what Olivia said, it's always the first step to see if you have a product or plant-based or which is really high in specific nutrients, or bioactive compounds. But the other, at the end, maybe a main question is it really bioaccessible, bioavailable? Can you really benefit or your body from these nutrients or from the food, or is it like, embedded in the food matrix and doesn't get absorbed, or not even fermented in the colon? All these things can happen. So that's what Olivia said, a huge, really hot, inverted commas topic and at the moment. And but that's really, that's a good question. And we have this, unfortunately, because it's all natural products, a huge variation between, even between in the same location, but from season to season. And that was actually last question, but I have a question, Olivia. And you mentioned this, I think that's very interesting, with the oh no, there's another one coming in. I can put this. Okay, another one from Michael Rio. Over the past decade or so, meal kits made by various companies such as HelloFresh and Marley Spoon are becoming popular amongst consumers. Have there been many clinical investigation studies to date into whether these ready-to-eat meal kits produce meals that meet the macronutrient and micronutrient requirements of the demographic that consume them?
Great question. And I think the really positive thing about those services is that they're encouraging people to cook at home again. And there certainly was a resurgence of that COVID through using those meal kits. And that's a very positive aspect of that. And as far as clinical studies to see if they're meeting our requirements, I haven't seen any. That doesn't mean there aren't any. I haven't really been looking for them, but I'll have a look and let you know too. But it's like an interesting area to look into. And I guess it would depend on, how often people were having them, whether it formed their entire way of eating, or whether it was something they just did occasionally every now and then. It wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact, but if it was something they were doing every day, it would certainly be worth looking into.
So it's interesting. I just what this question from Michael said, that's very popular, but I haven't seen any, like industry data, the increase, of let's say the past 3-4 years, through the pandemic, how they increase in the percentage. It would be interesting to see the popularity of this. Because so far we didn't actually never use this so far, so I can't comment on this. But I know it's getting more and more popular, and So my question. Oh, another one. I can't. Again from Anonymous. Okay. Do you think it would be important to also look into cooking methods that preserve nutritional values of vegetables, but also enhance flavor? Considering consumption choices made is mostly based on convenience and taste than nutritional value. That's correct. Olivia, what comment on this?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. And we need to. There have been some studies done on various cooking methods. We know about how we should best steam our vegetables, for example, since I've been talking a lot about vegetables, and how we shouldn't immerse them in water and then throw away cooking water. If you do want to cook them with some water, you should utilize the water in a sauce or, alongside the vegetables. So you're not throwing nutrition away, because it does leach into the cooking water. There's a suggestion that if you're using good nutrients like turmeric and those types of spices and things, to add them towards the end of the cooking session, so that you don't subject them to a heat throughout the cooking process, and just sprinkle them on at the end, so you get the best nutritional value. But these things are not necessarily widely known, and absolutely, if we want people to be able to incorporate these foods and get the most out of them and get the most nutritional value, we do need to be sharing this information and making it more widely known, and asking consumers and people what they need to know and what they'd like to know with regard to that.
So maybe I have a chance now for my last, I think it's anyway the last question. Olivia, you mentioned this, I think it's very interesting, as a maybe potential alternative, using frozen or deep, frozen fruits or veggies. And it's also very popular. And there was a study also in Europe when they, just compared, the nutrient content, which if it's like a high quality in a good process, was almost the same, like if you fresh, because sometimes fresh, it's depending even on the markets, it's in the sun, it's a couple of times lying there around and, get oxidized. So anyway, and that's what I think. And when you look just at the assortment, you can get it's so diverse. Could this be, because you mentioned there is in principle no waste. So obviously consumers, they eat the frozen, maybe all of the frozen fruits. Maybe I think it's more valuable. I don't know why, compared to the fresh one, which you've said you have all this waste. So could this be maybe not an alternative, but a part, like a part alternative, to fresh, to say at least, to increase the veggie and fruit consumption, to reach this, maybe I know it's very ambitious, this 5 serves still, but to get closer to this, to offer this as I'm not sure, alternative, or that consumers aware that frozen, if it's a good quality, could have the same quality, be on the same quality level than a fresh fruit or veggies. Not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there were certainly studies done in Australia a number of years ago comparing fresh versus snap frozen, and there was no difference. In fact, in some cases, the snap frozen could even have more nutrition in it because they're snap frozen when they're very fresh and then immediate and stored. So in comparison to, as you see, fruit and veg lying around and being oxidized and exposed to light and being in a refrigerator for a long period of time. So yes, I certainly, with the figures on the waste and what's that showing, it could be a viable option. And also, for example, the frozen berries and mixed berries, which are very dense in antioxidants and the nutrients we want to be having, they can improve the seasonality of being able to access these foods, across the year rather than just in the at the seasonal time. So yeah, it's a very strong potential to improve people's intake of these foods based on the latest evidence that we have.
I still think, not to say we will go away, from cutting fresh fruit
No,
and cooking,
not at all.
but I think just thinking you have this, like an alternative to say, okay, at least then we can increase or make maybe a popular alternative, to the fresh, something. No, I think we are at the end. So thank you very much for attending and zooming in. I see we have already a decline of participants from, I think, around 30 at the beginning to 16. But anyway, that's really great. Thanks so much. And if you have further questions, so just the best contact Olivia, right? Via her UQ email, or myself. We can then forward your questions. Something else coming up. Again, maybe one last question, Olivia, just to look. Oh no, it's just. Oh, fascinating. Oh, that's very nice. I have to read this. Thank you very much from Michael Rose. Thank you very much, Michael and Olivia. Alicia Matania Sutanda. Thank you so much, Olivia and Michael. A really fascinating seminar. Oh, that's very nice and very encouraging. Thank you very much for your comments. And yeah, so we have, I think, one last slide, Olivia. So look, and as you know, as usual, if you haven't already, signed into the seminar invitation list, please do so. You can always send an email to Craig Hardener. So he's the organizer of the seminar, and you can put your name on the list. And also, you can please scan the QR code if for your comments and feedback. That's really important for us. But please, keep it really professional, and when you criticize, which is great, that you can take this on, and can improve improve the seminar or the the procedure, for next year. And yeah, I also want to mention next week's QAAFI seminar. It's about exogenous RNI for sustainable plant protection, and will be presented by Dr. Anne Sawyer, who is a research fellow at the Center for Horticultural Science. So I think that's all for today. Again, thank you so much for attending and zooming in. I know you're all very busy, and yeah, hopefully I see you soon at the next seminar. Bye.